Hello and welcome to Threads of Fate. I am your host, Kier Ryberg, and we are joined once again by the absolutely incredible artist, astrologer, creative, mystic, herbalist, Chloe Margherita for an episode on the decans of Gemini. Well, specifically the first decan of Gemini. We've been doing we're not just gonna all of a sudden change pace and start throwing every
Never.
single one at you. We have to give them each their individual moment to shine. But we have been doing decan by decan episodes, and we have finally arrived to the sign of Gemini. And I am personally invested in this one because my ascendant is in that first decan of Gemini. So I've got a lot of thoughts. I've got a lot to
Yes.
say. Chloe and I were talking about it last night, and there was just some really interesting conversations happening. So I'm excited to share those with you guys. Chloe, welcome to the show. How are you feeling about
Thank
doing this
you.
episode?
I'm feeling great. I love that it's in many ways going to be the Kira Appreciation Hour. I feel like in a lot of ways you have redeemed and expanded my idea of Gemini, especially Gemini 1, because as we get into it, I feel like it's kind of like the most maybe like prototypical version of
Hmm.
the sign. And yeah, I mean, I have a ton of stuff in Sagittarius, so I am very interested in exploring this duality.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's the case for so many of the decans is like the first decan is usually the stereotype that we have of the sign because that is the sign's decan. Like this is a
Yeah.
Jupiter Mercury decan, which means that it's a Jupiter decan in some traditions, but in the other tradition, it's a Mercury decan because it is the Gemini decan. And so from that context, it's like, of course, we get kind of the most stereotypical version of what we think a sign is in that first 10 degrees. And this one is no different. And I think, there is a lot to it that's really interesting. And I think that Mercury Jupiter interplay is something that I'm always really fascinated by, whether it's here or in other
Oh, yeah.
decans or just like through conjunction, through bounds. I think they're a really interesting pair. And I'm curious, like, I know you've done a lot of work on the planetary pairs. How do you think about
Yes.
Jupiter and Mercury together?
Yeah, love that question. Yeah, just to let you all know, you could really just delineate a chart extremely well just by paying attention to what planets are particularly conjoined or opposed or in mutual reception. And I actually have Mercury and Jupiter conjoined or co-present in the same sign. And so this is something I think about a lot because in some ways, right, they're very similar, right? They're both planets of knowledge, of collecting information, but they do be very different because Mercury is he's a little trickster. They like to go here
Hmm.
and there, and I'm not necessarily consistency is not a thing they think about. They're considered, good with the good planets, and a little more, devilish with like the malefic. So they're very changeable. And Jupiter is like, can feel very like a what do I want to say, like a downer to that play because Jupiter's like, no, we have to consider morals and ethics and
Hmm.
what's the bigger picture, what's the system. So having these two together, Austin calls it like the lore master combination because it's
Mm.
like you're able to, on the other hand, gather and collect a lot of little bits of information and kind of turn them into like a bigger body of work. So he particularly like people who like gather people's archives or letters or like sort of stewards for like a larger field of knowledge. But there's so many different ways. Like together, they just at the very least portend a lot of intelligence, which I think is very true for this decan. I mean, look at Kira.
I'm gonna try not to just cringe every time you say something
Good,
complimentary.
good. You shouldn't.
But yeah, I often think about it as like they are kind of two sides of the same spectrum, but they have common goals, right? They're both
Yeah,
really interested in learning and wisdom and education. Mercury more about the dissemination of information, and Jupiter in teaching. And on the surface, those might look like the same thing, but they're not. Mercury is not really concerned with whether or not something is true. Jupiter is very concerned with that, right? Like Mercury just loves a story, loves a bit, loves a data point. And Jupiter is a little bit more like, what's the why? What's the philosophy behind this? And when they do kind of combine their influences, I think we get a little bit of both, right? Like there is that kind of duplicitousness that Mercury can bring to the table, but also Jupiter's influence trying to kind of balance that out and moderate it. And then depending on where and how they are combining, one of them is usually going to kind of take precedence, right? So, like in this very first decan of Gemini, for example, it's usually going to be Mercury because this is Mercury's home sign. And so you're going to get a little bit more Mercury, a little bit less Jupiter, except for the fact, and I say this every time, that I'm not going to do the bounds, and then I can't help it. Um,
Please.
the first decan of Gemini has Mercury's bounds and Jupiter's bounds within it. And so those first few degrees are going to be about Mercury, and you're really, really going to feel the mercurial influence versus that kind of, second part from 6 to 10 degrees is going to be Jupiter. And you're going to get a little bit more of that jovial influence. So also to say that there's going to be different kind of spheres of influence that are kind of coming through with the bounds that can also be overlaid on top of the story of the decan that we're going to talk about, that kind of shift and maybe pull you more towards one side or the other, which I think with Mercury and Jupiter, it shows up in interesting ways, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. Yeah, of course. And that's another thing is like we're dealing with the Mercury decan with a Mercury bound of a Mercury sign. And so one of the things you can guarantee is trickiness or a lot of different manifestations, right? Mercury doesn't necessarily need or value consistency.
A read for me personally with my ascendant in the Mercury bound of this decan. And I can attest to the fact that I'm always doing a million different things. And even when I start something, like you can ask Chloe, what was it? Like the other day, I was like, oh, okay, I have these 3 different projects that I took time off to work on. What if I just did a whole new lecture right now? Like I have an hour, and then like by the end of it, I have like a 20+ page slide deck.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't even have time to do this. Like I don't know when. This isn't built into my content schedule.
Ooh, she's starting. That's how I feel like when
you can't help it sometimes. I think with like Mercury wants you to go every which way, and it can be hard to find the directionality that I think Jupiter can often provide. Because when you think about, for example, like Jupiter sign of Sagittarius, right, the centaur, it has the bow and arrow, it has a direction, it has a place that it wants to get to, it has a target, right? Mercury doesn't really have a target. Mercury's like, what if I went here and then there and then back over here and then back over there? And so I think this decan in general can really show up as people who do a lot of different things, who wear many hats. I often think of it as almost like, and this is true a little bit for the second decan of Gemini as well, as we'll get into in the next episode, but I think of it as like the multi-hyphenate decan.
Oh, totally.
It's like people who can wear many hats, who have a lot of different skill sets, and it's kind of like the jack of all trades decan, And I think a lot of people hear that like in consultations and stuff like that, and they're like, so I'll never be a master of one.
Master of none.
And it's like, no, that's not true. But also if you remember what the entire quote is, it's like jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. And we never talk about that second part of the quote. No. And the thing that I am constantly telling people in sessions and stuff like that is like the most interesting people that you've ever met in your life have probably lived many lifetimes within one, right? They've gone down so many different paths. They've gone here, they've gone there, and then they found a way to weave all of these seemingly disparate threads of their fate together in a really pun intended, in a really interesting and fascinating way. And then they show up as this multifaceted being who has layers and layers and layers to unpack. And that is really juicy and interesting. And that's not to say that someone who does one thing for their entire life isn't an interesting person, but it's different kinds of interesting,
Right. Yeah, I mean, we just came from Taurus, right? Fixed Earth, which is about a maintenance of a specific process or cycle, one that's very much about, right, like things coming to fruition, right? There's a lot of agricultural metaphors. But here it's like we're at the very tip of Gemini. And so, right, we're dealing with a cardinal deck and one that's about the process of initiation. And so if you have placements here, it's going to be about starting, right? And in some ways, like I've kind of noticed, it's like if you can see, that each decan is, a stage of an action, right? You still have to go through the whole action no matter what sign is involved. But if you have stuff in like the first decan, it's like starting is where like I feel like the karma really comes in, and then the finishing and stuff will come later. But I really feel like, as Kira's saying, it's about trusting all of your different parts and selves and the things that you're into, but somehow in that jovial way, kind of having that like bigger picture mindfulness of, wait, when are you doing this in a way that is distracting, right? It's kind of a fine line because Mercury thrives in chaos and contradiction. But like, as Kira can attest, like they still can be overwhelmed.
Oh, 100%. And I think we think about that a lot with this Decan, right? Is like this concept of decision
Yeah.
paralysis. It's like you have so many different paths you could go down when you are a jack of all trades. It's like, well, I could do anything and I could probably get decently good at it, good enough to
Yeah.
make a living or good enough to fulfill XYZ. But then there comes that feeling of, okay, then what path do I choose? And I think placements here can be kind of haunted by that, of that
Hmm.
stress or that tension of feeling like there is a right choice, when in reality, there's not necessarily a right choice. Every choice is just going to take you one step further. And then often you're going to find yourself circling back to other pathways, other ideas, other processes and projects that then, kind of make everything make sense together. But that overwhelm can be something that I think is very inherent to this Decan. And we see it show up so much through the tarot card
Oh,
that's
totally.
associated with this space, which is the Eight of Swords. And I'll bring it up for people who are watching the
Please.
video version. But if you've never seen this tarot card before, it's basically like a woman who is bound by, cloth or rope, and she has all of these swords kind of scattered about her, and she's blindfolded. And it's usually not a card that like most people are stoked to draw, you know?
Right. It's not the worst, but you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. And it's like, well, where do I go? And she kind of looks
Yeah,
like she might be taking a step forward, but she's not really. She's kind of rooted in place and she's bound and tied. And usually, to me, it's like the feeling bound by possibility, right? Swords are
totally.
the air, element. And so it's like, oh, well, there's all these different ideas and thought ways and paths that I could go down, and I just don't know which one to do. So what if I just stood still? And like didn't make a choice. And I think that can be almost like the catch of this Decan, is to not let yourself stop moving, because there is this kind of mutability that's present throughout all of Gemini, but especially this space being the Gemini Decan as well. It's like you have to be flexible, you have to be mutable, you have to go where the wind blows you, and be okay with not necessarily knowing where that leads.
Right, right. And I love with this card, T. Susan Chang kind of compares this image in the deck into like when you're working with a sewing machine and the thread from the spindle gets all tangled up, right? It's like there's so many like little strands and details that can go in so many ways. But right when they come together, it can feel like I don't know where to go, or, it's a jumbled mess. And so, right, there is a thing of like how you have to maybe sometimes go with the chaos or trust that like
Mm-hmm.
you kind of have to dive into like complex situations or areas. But I'm also thinking like with the Jupiter aspect, there is like sometimes the next move is to like take that big view and to like
Mm-hmm.
to pause, right? How do you pause without stagnating? It's like
Yes,
I think a question for
totally.
this
That's a
second.
really, a really good question. And I think keeping the big view in mind is so key, right? Because when you do that, then you're able to say like, okay, this one thing that might seem completely unrelated to the long-term goal or project actually is going to bring me closer to fulfilling it, even if it doesn't seem readily apparent to other people. And I think that's part of this too, is like with this card, she's kind of sitting on water, right? And water to me is always going to bring up this concept of intuition. And it's like, well, if you know and you can trust your inner knowing, then you're going to be sure that you're going in the right direction. But you have to develop that kind of self trust. And you also have to get quiet enough, which is, as I can attest to, the ultimate struggle, right? To be able to really receive the guidance and the wisdom of your intuition, instead of thinking like, oh, well, I know that that's kind of what my gut says, but I think I'm just going to go over here instead. It's like, well, maybe if you slowed down and really thought about it, you'd realize that that's pointing you in a certain direction for a reason. And that might
Yeah.
be the thing that unbinds you from this situation that feels overwhelming or constraining in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think about the fact that I have my South Node here as well, which I think is maybe like the hardest placement to like think about because it's literally like a place of like absence.
Totally.
Because of that, like the much more like contemplative, like quieting the mind side of this Decan is really salient for me, right? I have it in the 11th house. And one of the ways that's manifested is, being part of spiritual communities. And, I would not say that I have a naturally quiet, chill disposition or mind. So it's like and I kind of knew it's like I need to be part of a bigger community that forces me to meditate, to like
Yeah.
slow my mind down. And it did work. But it's against that tendency to like stuff a lot of marshmallows in my mouth. It's like, I feel like with the South Node, there's this tendency, well, what if I just effort really hard and gather all this stuff and try really hard? And that South Node is like, what if you renounce all of that and like
Yeah.
value simplicity and the fool, which is a big archetype in Zen Buddhism, which I practice. And that was really hard for me. There's this one line in one of the chants, like, with practice hidden, function secretly like a fool, like an idiot. Like, if you do this continuously, you will be the host within the host. And I was like, I don't want to be an idiot, right? But it's like, I feel like that's the duality of Gemini, of Mercury. It's like,
Totally.
can you, like, to, in order to be wise, like, you have to be foolish about something first, or you have to be a
Absolutely.
beginner. And I think that's what this Decan wants, is to maintain that sort of like youthful curiosity.
Yes, absolutely. That just made me think of a million things, and in a Gemini one fashion. I don't know which one to pick up. But
You're
it's making
welcome.
me think about how, yes, thank you. I was like Jupiter's kind of presence in this decan as well, of right. Like Jupiter is a little bit more the meditative type rather than Mercury, right? Like Mercury is like, let me try to problem solve by reading every article online that I can possibly find about this and
Yes.
seeing if that will make me feel better. It doesn't, but we do it anyway. And Jupiter is a little bit, not meditation in the Saturn sense, but in the way that's like there is a greater wisdom to be had, and it's probably not going to be
Yeah,
found on like what, like self-diagnosing on WebMD. You know what I mean? Like it's a
exactly.
different kind of thing. And so I feel like there
Hmm.
is that Jupiter call to like slow down, right? And Jupiter moves a lot slower than Mercury does. Mercury zips through the zodiac, and Jupiter takes almost a year to go through an entire sign, right? So their speeds and their pace is very, very different, and we can kind of see a collision of those two approaches in this decan, where it's like slowing down can be the antidote to some of that mercurial buzzing, that
Yeah,
wants to go here, there,
yeah.
and kind of flit back and forth between different whatever. And so I think that was one of the things that made me think of, was kind of that Jupiter influence here being almost like the help to some of the overtly
Yeah.
mercurial, qualities that show up
Yes,
here through this being Mercury sign.
completely.
And yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to have a lot of patience to deal with this, and it's kind of like untangling a thread. Like, it reminds me of an event that happened just around when Jupiter ingressed into Gemini. So when Jupiter was had decanic dignity, but right, Jupiter is also detriment in Gemini. That's worth
Hmm.
noting. So like, even though there's like this little pocket of skills that he has in this first 10 degrees, he's still, this isn't natural for him. And
Yeah.
so there was this one night, just like last May, where I was out with a group of friends, and there were people I haven't seen in a while, and it was like so fun. But all of them had food allergies. So we go to this restaurant, and basically we're listing, to the waiter all of the various, sensitivities. And he comes back with like a marked up menu, but even though we can't really understand it. So we literally go back and forth for like 20 minutes to like figure out, what can we eat? Is this going to be okay for this person? No, it's not okay for that person. And like, what am I going to say? Like, I can't get mad if my friends don't want to get sick from getting,
Yeah,
from eating
totally.
out at a restaurant. But at the same time, it requires a lot of patience, a lot of like
Hmm.
dealing with complexity. And I'm sure when we left, they were like, thank God they're gone. And that's kind of what Jupiter and Gemini feels like, especially I think in, that first 10 degrees is like, yeah, you'll get the beneficence, but you have to sweat about the details like way more than Jupiter prefers, right? Jupiter's the big picture, right? But then with the
Totally.
Mercury sign, it's like, okay, well, now I also have to file everything and like deal with a bunch more, logistics than I wish I had to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those logistics just like kind of annoy Jupiter. He's not really interested in that, right? It's like
Yeah, he's
the
the
big
idea
picture
guy.
versus, yeah, the idea guy versus like the details. And here we can kind of find, in the best case scenario, someone who's capable of doing both, who can go really into the details and who can also zoom out and see the big picture.
Yes.
And that's kind of the best that this decan has to offer. But that doesn't mean the internal experience of the person with placements here is harmonious or feels as harmonious as maybe the presentation of that information or whatever the thing is looks on the outside.
Yes.
So there's a little bit of like maneuvering that has to be done here. But there is, yeah, it's like these are the two planets of education and learning and wisdom. And so we do see people who tend to be a little bit more concerned with matters of the intellect, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
reminds me of the
Mm-hmm.
Agrippa quote for this decan, which is, a man in whose hand is a rod, and he is, as it were, serving another, and it granteth wisdom and the knowledge of numbers, and arts in which there is no profit.
I'm sure Mercury loves.
I'm like, I love that Agrippa was like, and you're gonna be broke. Excuse me.
Poor Pavo, but
Don't be
smart.
rude, Agrippa.
I like the Ibn Ezra quote, which is a woman standing in the air and she can sew.
Yeah, I was thinking about this so much today, the Ibn Ezra one, because I was listening to this podcast this morning. Let's talk about myths, baby, and they were talking about women's role in ancient Greece and just ancient cultures,
Mm-hmm.
civilizations in general, and how women's role was often to story tell, right? But we story told through weaving and through textiles, and how the word text comes from textus, which is like this connection to
Of course.
textile and
Yeah.
text. And it's like we have this very mercurial kind of Jupiter Decan here that is so concerned with words and wisdom and stories and how do we present this information. And then we come back to, well, we do it through not just, writing it down, but also through literally sewing and weaving. And then my mind was going, because this is what a Gemini one mind goes. I was thinking of of the goddess Athena and how she is the goddess of wisdom and also the goddess of weaving. And so you have like these relationships between wisdom and weaving. And it made me just think about that Ibn Ezra quote, where it's like so much of our history that maybe isn't written down in the history books, but is preserved in other modalities that came primarily from women is going to be very different than the history that we have that is written down by men or, yeah, the people who won who won history,
Exactly. The
right?
victors. Right, right. Yeah, yeah, there is, I think, there is a very, and we'll get to it when we get to the deity, like a very feminine side to this decan as well, as you're saying. And I think weaving is such a good metaphor for Gemini one because it's like these tiny threads, coming together into a whole, but there's a lot of
Hmm.
skill and a lot of attention to detail required because of that. And I think, right, being both Mercury and Jupiter, right, it's not just about, right, the facts or being really dry. It's like, can you combine, yeah, like that thinking and feeling, right? And especially the jovial influence, it's about including it all, right? He doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily divide between like, oh, that's too emotional. And so that is not wisdom, right? It's
Yeah.
like, how can we let the more, yeah, sort of like watery or intuitive parts of ourselves also be part of like the larger, warp and weft.
Yeah, it's like the gnosis component, right? It is the experiential wisdom that Jupiter brings to the table that is very
Yeah.
different than the kind of more academically minded wisdom that Mercury seeks. Like I think about Mercury as kind of like a podcast, right? You listen to a podcast, you get other people's opinions. That's a way to, understand and gain information and intelligence. There's a totally other side of it that's going out and finding it for yourself, right? Looking at different charts and seeing how these stories come to life through your own experience of them by doing channeling or gnosis sessions where you're literally going out and just trying to figure out like, what does this mean if like outside the context of a text or outside of the context of another
Exactly.
person's opinion, right? And I think wherever we get Mercury and Jupiter is like we get people who can do both, right? It's like
Yeah.
you can do the gnosis and you value the gnosis, and also you can do the research and the academically kind of, slanted thing as well. And then when you bring those together, I think, magic happens. And maybe I'm a little biased, but
Thank
I
you.
know me and you both are like, hello.
Can do it all.
But it does, it does, like Agrippa says, like it granteth wisdom, right? And
Yeah.
it's the kind of wisdom that is well informed because it's coming of you, through you, and also through others. And I think that's kind of like the best case scenario, right?
Right, right. And I feel like with that, with Jupiter, there's this really strong desire to like to live or embody the things that you
Mm,
believe or you think about. Like I know that's something that I really struggled with in school is like, okay, we're talking about all of these really big, important like theories and concepts, but we're not talking about like, okay, how do we live our lives according to
yeah.
this? It's so special, right? How does that infuse us? And yeah, I don't know, when academia has kind of been this very like whittled down, objective, like brain in a jar sort of thing, it doesn't allow like the more sort of subjective or less like qualitative forms of knowledge. But it's like, what are we learning for? Right. I feel like Jupiter asks, what do we learn for if not to change our lives? right? Have that
Yes,
wisdom, as Kira said.
totally. And I think about that a lot with astrology as well. It's like, why do we learn it? Why do we learn it? You know, is it to stress out over transits, or is it to make our lives easier,
Right.
better, to accept our fate? You know, like all of these things. And I think a lot of the time, the way that astrological information is presented is not coming from a lens of, and this is how it improves your life. You know,
Right.
it's like, here's the technique, here is the information. And like, don't get me wrong, I'm all for technique.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
I'm a very technical bitch. You know what I mean? Like, you can go look at my
Yeah,
lectures
you
or
are.
whatever. I love it. But
You are.
also, I want to, like, I'm into technique because I think that when we get into the details, we get story, we get nuance, and that is where
Exactly.
our lives are lived, right? Is in the details. And I think then when you start doing
Oof.
that, it's like, oh, now I know how to kind of either align myself with the rhythm and the harmony of the spheres to create a more peaceful existence for myself, right? Or something like electional astrology, where it's like I'm learning so much technique. Like if you take my electional astrology course, it's literally like it's very info
Which you
heavy.
should.
It's very info heavy because it has to be, but it's in service to the fact that it's going to make your life easier. You know, it's like
Totally.
it's how do we live like an embodied astrology is something that I think about all the
Right.
time.
Or even I love that you brought up the etymology of the word text. Like that's honestly
Mm,
like if I'm starting, like often if I'm starting an essay or a newsletter, the first thing it's like, I'm thinking about power. What is the etymology of power? And
we
sometimes it's
both
like
do this.
really like, yeah, because it's so cool. Because when you
Yeah.
find something, like I was looking up the word bully used to mean lover, right? Right. And then
Stop.
it's like, or the word sacred is related to sacrifice, right? It's
Hmm.
if you pay attention to these details and something as simple as like the history of words, you can find like this whole, right, multifaceted meaning, right? Where like things that feel contradictory come together under this like one word that we don't even think about that contains so much. And I feel like that's what the Jupiter side of it is like, right? If you really, really focus in on a detail, right? It's like a fractal of like new
Yeah.
knowledge and universes opens up to you.
And meaning, right? Like Jupiter is about the meaning. It's like we can
Exactly.
go into the details and all of these kind of like facts and data points, but it's to inform a greater worldview, right? It's
Exactly.
to find and make meaning in our lives and of our experiences. And I think that is, yeah, at the heart of Gemini 1 is like, how do we do both? How do we kind of make space for the Mercury and for the Jupiter, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious. I mean, totally up to you, but how do you feel like this dynamic has played out in some way in your life?
Oof. Well, the one thing that I think of is not necessarily related to this dynamic, but the thing that when I was learning about the decans and I learned about Gemini 1 that really clicked with me
Mhm.
was this is the start of the story of the twins, right? And so this is where we have where one becomes two in a lot of ways. And I'm going to try to say this in a way that isn't like too personally reviewed um, about
Of
my
course.
childhood. But you know, there was kind of like this division. My parents got separated when I was very young. It was an extremely nasty divorce. And I felt like I split in two. Like my parents used to say when I was younger, like, oh, you're still on your dad's, like you're still your dad's Kira right now, or you're still your mom's Kira. And I felt like I was like two different people depending on what house I was at. And I'm sure other children of divorce can like totally relate to this as well. But it was very loud in my experience. And I felt very much like it was the division of one into two in my childhood. And now, like, I moved abroad and I have these two identities. I have two homes. I am of two places. I like California is my home and it's also not my home anymore. And France is my home and it's also not my home anymore. And I'm kind of straddling this identity of two. I always feel like I lose when someone finds out I'm American. Today I was going for the dog walk with my husband and our daughter and the neighbor was like, you have a bit of an accent, which I'm always like, like I've lost the game. And I'm like, where are you from? And like we've talked with these people, like here and there for like a year now, right? And so I had to tell them I'm American. And I felt like in that moment, then like my two identities are revealed and I'm once again split into two in these people's minds. And it's like this constant thing where I want to just be the one, but I can't. Like I can't escape that I am, these two different versions of myself. And I think that that is one of the ways that I really kind of related to this decan. And even like my daughter has her Jupiter here, right? And like she will be bilingual, right? And she has an American mom and a French father. And like she is also going to have a little bit of that duality existing within
Mhm.
her. And I think there is kind of this need to, I think maybe in the second decan of Gemini, which we'll get in next time, there's a little bit more of like an ability to hold both. And here I think there's a little bit more of the tension of it's the initial division. And so that feels grating in some ways where it's like, ooh, like, can I be both? I am, and I can't control that. But it's not as complementary, I think, as Gemini 2 is, where it's like holding both and existing outside of the binary in some ways, where it's like Gemini 1 kind of still wants to fit in the binary a little bit,
Yeah.
and then you can't. It's not a
Of
choice.
course. Yeah. Or like, I mean, and that, because that's what's most striking about your story is it's fate kind of imposing that. It's not like
Mm.
you come, it's not like I necessarily see you coming out being like, I want to be two people. It's like you necessarily are these two people who are both true, but right, maybe feel like they're at odds with each other. And it's making me think too of like that initial duality of this like beginning decan of the sign and how like right in some ways you have to reckon with like saying yes to something and saying no to something else, right? Maybe not
Totally.
forever, but right now there is going to be that like if I'm this then I'm not this, right? And I can, it's
Yes.
maybe switching back and forth, but maybe you have to choose. And there's always a mourning, a loss whenever you like say goodbye to something.
Yeah, and I feel that in my work a lot. Like I want to chase one. Like I have a million. I'm not even kidding. Like if you guys
Who's
saw,
not?
you don't even want to know how long my to-do list or my idea list is for different projects I want to work on. And I always kind of feel like this heaviness or this morning when I pick one, because that means I can't do the 50 other things that I want to do. And then I start the thing, and halfway through, I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do the
Right, because
other
the
one.
right because now you're in the middle and it's like, oh, it's different
Yeah.
now.
Yes, in the middle's the worst part for me. It's like the starting is so fun and that's
Mhm.
so like first decan, right? It's like I
Right,
love
of
the
course.
initiation of it. And I'm not a cardinal person either. So like this really does express through I don't have any cardinal traditional planets.
Same, yeah.
Um so like it's not that. It is very much this kind of division of this first decan that I'm like I can't getting to the end of something is hard for me. And I've got a ton of fixed placements. It's like I've got the staying power, but it's still like a struggle to get there. And I would much rather start one thing. Like I do this with books. It's like it shows up in every context of my life because it's
Right,
my
of
ascendant decan,
course.
right? It's like I start a book, I get 50 pages in, I really like it, and then I see another book and I get excited and I buy the book and then I start that book. And then I do this forever on repeat, and like I have to force myself to sit down and finish a book. Like I keep starting, I've been thinking to myself that I need to elect when I start books
You
so
should,
I'll finish them.
yeah, use the Mercury to do the Jupiter thing. Because, like, right, obviously, like the consistency is going to be harder in this decan because Jupiter is
Totally.
just so much at a disadvantage to Mercury. And it's like you even see that, like, right, people have like Mercury and Gemini in this first decan. It's like, bam, like they are something else. But right,
Yeah.
as Jupiter and Gemini is, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that develops in your daughter because it's such a
Mm.
fascinating placement. It's never going to be straightforward, I feel.
No, no, never, never. And yeah, I think too, it's just like there's this kind of there's this dispersion here in Gemini 1, right? Where you can learn many things, go many places. And it reminds me of the Agrippa thing where it's like,
Yes.
it's like this knowledge that there is no profit from. And one of the people that I think about with this decan all the time is Ken Jennings,
Yes, such a
who
good example.
who, if you guys don't know who Ken Jennings he is like the Jeopardy,
Like
probably like
highest
highest,
winner.
yeah, highest
Yeah.
winner, champion of all of the things, right? He now hosts it after Alex Trebek's death, right? Like he is the Jeopardy champion until probably this current like stage of society. Having all of that information, you're not making money on that. Like
No.
that's not really a skill set that, oh, I know about like what year this war happened in, and then I also happen to know about this one
Yeah.
invention from whatever. It's like this kind of the dispersion of information, the ability to collect and amass an immense amount of data points is not always something that is going to be profitable right
No.
now. I think we live in a world that's a little bit more conducive to that, but prior, not so much. And Ken
Right.
Jennings has his son here. And of course, he's like the guy who knows everything about everything. Right. And going back to that idea that it like means you can't be a master of anything. It's like, well, you're a quiz master.
Right.
You're
You're the best at your bar trivia.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I love, but I feel like the Jupiter part, is able to, right, at least jockey or attempt for some like elevation or position. Cause I love that, right? While he's like such a good game player and that's how he came up, right? It's his legacy is kind of cemented by him taking the mantle over for Alex Trebek, which is a really big mantle. He's like a very popular figure. And I think people were generally very happy with Ken Jennings being chosen. And I'll also say he
Totally.
started out co-hosting with someone else, Maya Bialik, who's not as popular, right? That Gemini duality. We had to get her out of there. And now it's
Yeah.
like, but like it's so there's something really heartwarming about him. Like it's like no one else but him, I think,
Could
could
have done that.
like even try. And I think that's where like the Jupiter part of like you're part of a legacy or there's like a bigger body of work that you're a part of. It's not just you knowing facts. It's like this whole like this long running show that is like I think a huge part of like a lot of people's like lives.
Yeah, totally. Like I'm such a Jeopardy person. Like, of course, with
Oh
my
yeah, my
ascendant
parents. It's like
Gemini
I feel
one.
like my family texts about it a lot. Of like, oh my, dad got the double Jeopardy, answer, and no one else did. And I was like, ooh.
I love that. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's like, it does give kind of this wide breadth of knowledge and this wide breadth of skills. And sometimes that can be applied more in the context of like what we were saying earlier about being like a multi-hyphenate, right? Like I think of
Right.
someone like Barack Obama who has his moon here. And although we obviously think Obama president, we think one thing. Since he retired,
Wow.
he has gone
Yeah.
on to do so many things. He's
Made way
authored
more money
books,
doing that for
way more
sure.
money,
Yeah.
podcasts,
With
he
Bruce
does
Springsteen.
Netflix documentaries,
Yeah.
right? Like he does all of these different things now and he wears many hats, but he also
Mhm.
then was still president of the United States, right? Which is the Jupiter
Yes.
thing. It's like that legacy component that you're talking about, right? It's like you are able to kind of amass a certain amount of prestige, which I think Jupiter often gives, right? Like when you want honors, for example, you tend to go to Jupiter, right? Or the sun. And I think that we see that show up through Jupiter's presence in this decan, but it's also through your application of your wit and your wisdom and your skill sets that you get there. And that's what we
Yeah.
see with Obama, who has his moon here. So I always think of
Right.
him with this decan too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and he's known, especially like he's known for being a very good talker. And I think in that lunar way, he's good, right? Hope and change. He's good at like capturing like the emotions of people through his speech. And, the moon is also very much like a planet of the mind and communication, but I think a much more less factual and more like vibes based, which is like that's kind of what won him the presidency. I think being able to
Totally.
capture like a dream or people's emotions.
Hmm.
And then
He's very
on the other side,
charismatic.
yeah, right. And, and I think, and very learned as well.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it makes me think of like during his presidency, there was controversy around like the people he knew or like the beliefs he held, because he was like friends with a certain black pastor. And, we don't like that. Just like there are all these scandals that felt like they were nothing, or like even just like you're not born here, or God
Yeah.
forbid you're Muslim. And it's like, right, just like beliefs and origin, like all of this getting complicated, and right, the facts kind of getting skewed, which feels very like the lunar, like people are projecting onto him.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like with any luminary, I think there's going to be projection present in some
Yes.
way, shape, or
Yes.
form. So, like projection of someone's intellect, skills, embodied wisdom, right? With the moon is going
Right.
to oftentimes come through here. But yeah, there is still that ability to kind of,
Naturally smart.
yeah, naturally smart. And I think that there is kind of this charismatic energy to Gemini one when it can be contained in a way,
Mm-hmm.
and I think people like that. It's like people who are natural teachers, right? Natural speakers or
Yeah.
orators, and of course, there's also like a divinatory component here because you get Mercury, who is the planet that we associate with divination in general and astrology. And then Jupiter brings this kind of wisdom, sage
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
archetype into the picture where it's like, okay, now you can also share that wisdom with other people and help them, on their path or give them their why through your application of technical skills, finesse, and ideas.
As Kira's doing. And I'll also,
Thanks.
right. And I think that the key here, and you see this in the Agrippa quote, is you see a man who is serving another. And this is
Mm,
something you find a lot with Mercury is like he's like they're often put in like administrative or like
totally.
secretarial roles. Like that, Jupiter maybe more likes being in charge, but Mercury kind of likes working within a system. And so I think that's a big thing to think about is like, how is your knowledge serving others, right? Or if
Yes.
it's not serving others, it's like, can you see your practice, like, with the divination component as serving the divine, right? Like that is, why astrology was created was to get closer to
Hmm.
the divine. And so I think the key here is, right, to trust that you're on a journey that's bigger than you and your knowledge is not about like bolstering your ego. It's about being in a process with something bigger than you. Because of course, like,
100%.
if you want to see a negative example, like I think the perfect example that you listed here is Mr. Elon Musk with his Saturn moons. He
Yeah.
starts so many things, but he's actually not good at anything. How does that happen? Like
Oh,
he doesn't even like
100%.
he's a CEO of 5 companies and he tweets like 1,000 times a day and it's
This man isn't doing anything. Do you know what I mean? Except for ruining people's
yeah,
lives. And it's
right.
so funny too, because you see still like Jupiter still is granting like this prestige, right? Like weaseled
Right.
his way
People think he's
into
smart.
yeah, to the government of the United States, right? And in reality, every time that he's gotten his hands on a company, like it does worse,
Oh my God.
So it's like you
Yeah.
can see that there is also this other side to it where when we don't have the why, or when the why becomes um, mm, less for the divine, for the greater good of the public, for, I'm trying to figure out how to word this in the right way, but I'm getting lost on it. Is like, it's we can see that this becomes something that's a little bit more problematic, right? Where it's like people who are
Right,
just,
right. It's
I have
egoic.
all of these, yes, exactly. I have
Yeah.
all these ideas. Who wouldn't want to hear 100 tweets from me a day? And we're all like, Elon, I'm begging you to log off, like
Yeah,
begging
call
you,
your baby mama. Like, take
please.
care of your children.
One,
Like, you
and you can see
know,
like Grimes is like tweeting at him
like
like, "Can you call me
it's
back? Our
so
child is sick,"
embarrassing.
and it's so embarrassing.
Yeah, it is, and it's like, I mean, and I think the main thing is like you can go too fast, right?
Mm.
He embodies the like move fast and break things ethos. And if you want to, if I ever want to have a good afternoon, I just read about like Cybertruck stories. Like I read something yesterday that like Cybertruck loses like something like $65,000 in value, like driving the first 6,000 miles or something. It loses
Oh
basically
my
like
God.
560 like a mile in value, like the
I'm
second you
laughing
take it off the lot.
so hard at you being like, when I want to have a good, I
Like,
read about Elon Musk's failures.
hate
Relatable.
is a renewable resource for this man especially when it's like his whole thing is like making other people's lives worse. Like I think
Yeah.
it's a moral good to hate him actually. And
Me
that's
too.
a different podcast, but I needed to say that. I'm glad
No,
Kira agrees.
I totally agree. I love it. But yeah, you can see that there's different sides of this. There's ways that it can
Yes.
express more positively and ways that it can express maybe a little bit more negatively, depending on what placements are here, what the sect of the chart is, right? How is this going to come through is going to show up very, very differently depending on that. Just like we talked about with like Taurus too, right? There's some
Exactly.
ways that this can be the most beautiful decan, and also there's ways that it can become, you know, um, maybe not so maybe not so good, maybe not so
Mercury.
supportive for the greater
Yeah.
public, right? And that's the thing with Mercury is like Mercury doesn't deal in morality. Mercury
Yeah.
does not care. Jupiter is going to try to bring that, and I think like for me, for example, I have a very strong angular domicile Jupiter, right? So like for me, I can never go to like too far to the Mercury side of things without getting checked by Jupiter. Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know what Elon Musk's Jupiter situation is, but you can kind of see when all of a sudden we're doing all the Mercury. Mercury is the ruler of lying, deceit, trickery, stealing, like all of that. And so it's like, well, if you're going to go really hard on the Mercury, you're probably going to get people who are a little bit more willing to operate in that realm of things.
Yeah.
And sometimes for the greater good and sometimes not. You know, like
Right.
you could have a
Yeah.
Robin Hood or you could have an Elon Musk.
But and who I'll say, right, is not, and he's definitely more mercurial because he has it in the first, and he has like Jupiter like retrograde in Scorpio, like in conjunct. So like, yeah,
Yeah,
he's not,
yeah.
he's more about natalism than morality with that Jupiter.
For
But
sure. For sure.
anyway,
But yeah, I'm trying to think of like some other people who've got placements here. Like for the division, there was one that was really funny. For the division of one into two, the one of the things I loved for this was like Miley Cyrus has her lot of spirit here. And the way that Miley Cyrus got her start was by literally playing a character who was basically her, right? Miley Stewart instead of Miley Cyrus. And she was also Hannah Montana. It was like she
mhm.
was the division of one into two, leading this kind of secret life and trying to be one, but also having to be two, right? And it's funny because it comes through with like, yes, this is her lot of spirit. This is a character she played, but also that was her entire childhood that kind of
Yeah.
was the foundation of who she went on to become, right? And I think that you even hear her talk about that role and she's like, Hannah is still a part of me. And like, there is this, I think that that character still lives within her and lives within her soul and spirit. And it was a big part of how she got her start. Right. And so I just thought that was so funny for like the division of one into two
Yeah.
in the most literal
Yeah.
context.
And I feel like that's just played out in a lot of ways where like I think part of the reason she on the whole avoided a lot of the mess that I think a lot of Disney stars did was like from a pretty young age she like rebelled, right? And sort of like played with or sort of played against the kind of squeaky clean like Disney kid persona
Mm,
that was expected of her. And she was
totally.
given a lot of flack for doing things like smoking a bong, like, dressing like a little provocatively for a music video. And it's like when you look back at it, none of it was actually that bad. And I think like allowing herself to be like both of those things, like allowed her to be
Hmm.
much more steady later on. And I feel
Totally.
like, of course I don't know her. She's a celebrity, but I mean, I really like her because she seems like she really knows herself. She's not
Yeah.
necessarily like trying to be something else and is just kind of, yeah, following her muse and is not trying to be like one specific type of person, but seeing like how that unfolds within her.
Yeah, and it's like also people who can kind of genre bend, right? It's like people who can
Totally.
go and experience and find the value in expressing themselves in a multitude of ways, right? It's like they can't really be contained in the same context. And I think we
Can't be
see this through
tamed.
like can't be. Yes, she does have a song called "Can't Be Tamed," but yeah, like she's done more country music, she's done pop music, she's done rock music, right? She's done more
Mm-hmm.
singer-songwriter stuff.
She
There's
does great
all of
covers.
She does amazing covers. Even my husband, I've gotten him on to the appreciation of a Miley Cyrus cover. Like,
Oh, hell yeah. And
so
like
good.
weird stuff, like Cocteau Twins, like have,
Yeah.
to like a audience in Las Vegas and the whole time she's like, sorry, it's almost over. And I'm like, yo, queen, like expose them, please.
No, it's so
Yeah.
good. But yeah, there's so much this Decan that I think it's one of the ones that's kind of easy to get, but also it has a lot of layers when you start peeling them
Right.
back. And I know you have some really interesting takes on the deity that's associated with this,
Yes.
which is one of those ones that like when I first kind of was digging into it, and even still today, it's one of the ones I get the least, despite it being my
Mm-hmm.
ascendant decan, is like, what is she doing here? And so I'm gonna mispronounce this. I'm so sorry. Tethys.
That
Uh,
sounds nice. I like that.
I am trying to pronounce it the way that my mentee does because she's Greek, and when she says it, I'm like, oh, that's what it's supposed to sound like. And
Yeah,
the
I
way
can
that
see
I
that.
say it is like all I'm just reading these things. But she is a sea goddess, and she personified kind of marine fertility, and she plays a beneficial role where she intervenes in a couple of myths, but she is never kind of like the central character by any means. But Tethys has the same root as the word nurse or grandmother in Greek, which
Mm-hmm.
really connects her to almost this feminine, maternal, caretaking, nurturing energy, right? Like she was thought to be the goddess of creation through the primordial waters. And so when I hear that, I often think of like the sea of information that exists in Gemini 1 and being able to nurture and steward that information in a way that is kind of making sure you're taking care of it, right? Like, are you doing right by the data? Are you doing right by the information? And that was where my mind initially went, but I think that's a very surface level kind of understanding of it. And I know you have such interesting thoughts
Oh,
on this.
thank
So
you.
share them with everybody, please.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So, yeah, before I kind of get into the gnosis, because something I like to do in my practice in general is whether it's with a star or a planet or a decan, like when, electing a time when I can just sort of like do a ritual and meditate, right, in that very, South Node Gemini one way and sort of let like an image or let it speak to me. And I often find it's like if I suspend my disbelief, like I get some pretty wild stuff that I would not
Yeah.
be able to put together with just my mind. But I mean, at first I wanted to mention the flower essence that I made for Gemini 1 last year, which is the daisy, which is actually my last name, Margherita in Italian means daisy.
Oh
So
my
this is, yeah,
God.
yeah, isn't that cute? It's like I
Love.
was supposed to get into flowers. And I actually made this one at an elementary school. And it was like literally, and I went, and I usually go to this elementary school to walk my dog, but she just didn't want to get into the car. So it was just me. And there were like multiple children's baseball games like playing while this is happening.
Mm,
And so they're like just thinking about the energy of play. And also like there is very much like daisy, like flower essence is supposed to be good for like helping you like bring in a lot of information and sort of like keep it coherent and whole, which feels very Gemini one. But I feel
totally.
like one thing your kind of Tethys nurturing conversation had me thinking is like, right, how much children is related to like Gemini one, and like you have
Mercury
to
in
you
general.
right, and you can't be harsh to people who are just beginning, right? You have to,
Yeah.
make it a little easier. You have to, make sure that they feel comfortable, that they're resourced, that they're nurtured. And yeah, so I think that's a huge thing is like there can maybe be this tendency to be really exacting or harsh on yourself. But I think there has to be this gentleness because you're beginning anew. You're kind of childlike again and again.
Mm. Yeah, the
Yeah,
nurturing of the mind, I think, and nurturing of curiosity and seeing how far that can take you, right? It's like if
yeah.
a child asks you why, and you're like, oh, because I said so. It's like you're immediately repressing that child's like instinctual curiosity and desire to know about the world and their place in the world versus if you go in and you start understanding, oh, I have an opportunity here to impart wisdom and kind of fulfill or satiate or that desire for
Mhm.
curiosity. I think that there's something really beautiful that comes through here, and I think that's why this is such a great decade for teaching, right? Is like you have to have a little bit of that tenderness, that willingness to kind of understand where the person is at in their
Yeah.
journey as well, and then be able to give them the information that they need to get to the next place that they're headed.
Yeah, right. And yeah, I'm trying to fit this into the watery imagery. I mean, I feel like we're doing it, but there's is something of like trusting like the mystery or trusting how it's like I'm almost thinking there's a wholeness and a coherence to all of these disparate points, but right, it's
Yeah.
sort of God given, right? And I feel like
Mm,
maybe the ocean is a good example of that, where they talk about, right, a good, very common spiritual metaphor is like you can see yourself as a wave, right, as a point, but you're always made of the same thing as everything else. Um,
mm,
so yeah, so the gnosis that I got for this Decan was I got a scene of countless white seagulls all attached to the ground by white string. They are constantly moving, flying, shifting, and turning into new things, creating a lattice or a platform in the sky of overlapping white feathers. And then a lotus-born goddess. I got a really strong sense that she's Hindu. I kind of feel like she's Lakshmi.
mm.
Emerges. The seagulls form a platform for her below. In the blue shimmery water, a docile set of waves in the sand form a spiral staircase for her and bring her down to the ocean. I don't quite understand the mechanics of this. This was a year ago, but there's movement, there's seagulls, there's sand, and then the seagulls turn into a hand and grab something to the sky and give it to her. And then I say, but I forget what it is. Like even in the like I don't remember what it was. Like even though I had just done the ritual, so and we were talking about that too. It's like there's this really strong imagery of this of like many disparate things working together in a whole and like allowing
Hmm.
something like divine to be born. But
Yeah.
like there is a thing too of like can you trust that you don't have to hold everything in your mind, like that there's some details that can sort of wash away, and what is for you or what you're supposed to do or know, like, will come back to you. Like, I feel like that with a lot of my skills and interests. It's like maybe not now, but if you're really for me, like the ways will return you.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to be that way. But I think one of the things that we were talking about with this is like the concept of memory and how sometimes memory is fickle, which is a very
Yeah.
mercurial kind of thing, right? But also that there is the Jupiter sense of memory that is deep knowing. And you might not know how you know it, how you got there, but it's like this felt memory. But there can also be like a forgetfulness that shows up here too, which is it's so funny that it comes through in your gnosis of like, what did I don't know,
Yeah.
you
Forget what
know?
she gives her. It's probably important, but
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like sometimes too, I think we have to forget. Like sometimes it is in one ear and out the other until you're ready to grab a hold of it and make meaning out of it and make sense of it. And otherwise, it's just not the right time. And I think there's kind of that quality with this decan of like, there is a little bit of forgetfulness here, but there's also that deep knowing and trusting the deep knowing is also a way to combat the forgetfulness because it's like you said, if it's meant for me, it will come back around and I will be ready to receive it when it is the opportune moment for it to arise again.
yeah. And I'm almost wondering too, it's like thinking, the ocean is a very powerful cleansing metaphor. So something of like cleaning the slate or having to forget, right, the last time you did something, because then you wouldn't do it again, right? Or having to
Mm.
start anew, right, requires you to kind of let go of what you were doing, as I'm
Yeah,
sure you can
absolutely.
attest.
Yeah, and it's the mutability too, isn't it? Where it's like sometimes you have to just like be ready for change, be ready to change your mind. And I think that's one of the things that really annoys people about Gemini or the stereotype of
Mm-hmm.
Gemini is like, you're so flaky. And it's like, well, no, I was presented with new information and I changed my mind because I'm better informed now, and that
Sorry.
is usually yeah, it's like, do you not want me to grow and evolve as I learn new things? Or should I say stuck in the way that I was 10 years ago when I didn't have that information? And I think that that can be very annoying to people on the surface, but what's at the heart of it is this information component is like, no, like I know better now, I'm smarter now, and because of that I'm going to make a different choice, or my
Right.
opinion is going to change. And that is the nature of mutability in general, is that it has to be flexible, right? Mutable signs represent the end of a season when we are kind of in this state of constant change, right? We're not really in whatever, spring. We're kind of in summer. We're doing this as the sun is about to ingress into Gemini 1 today. So it's perfect timing for us to be recording this episode, because it's fitting with the seasonal quality of the moment. But there is
Mm-hmm.
kind of that feeling of, yeah, like you have to be open and willing to change, um, because otherwise you stagnate. And this is not a stagnation decan, and stagnation is probably the worst thing for this decan. It's like getting that decision paralysis that we talked about at the very beginning, and then you stagnate and you feel stuck. And I think the key with this is to always keep moving, always keep changing, always keep evolving and growing. And yeah, that's really to me like what's at the heart of this
Totally.
decan.
And if what is, not the prototypical symbol of constant change, but water.
Totally. 100%. Such a great point. Such a great point. Well, I think we did this deck in justice. Is there anything else that you feel like you need to add or that we didn't get to that we should absolutely cover?
I don't think so. I think I'm really glad we got to this more watery imagery, but I think, yeah, I think we covered a lot of its duality and complexity very well, I would say.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys for joining us for another episode of Threads of Fate, and we will catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.